morning, namaste, salam, sat sri akal, and everything else we say in India to greet the day. I am an informal person, so I'll begin slightly formally, but I'm going to lapse into informality, because that's the way I communicate. And so you will forgive me for it, or applaud for me for it, I don't know, but whatever it is, it's going to be a conversation. So I begin by thanking Father Charles and Vinay for inviting me to St. Joseph's to share my views with you. In a sense, I've been doing that all my life, sharing my views, and that's been an important part of my existence. So it's a continuum of what I do every day, but thank you very much for this special privilege of sharing it with so many young minds. I'm going to start with what is my prayer. And my prayer is your prayer. It's a prayer for India and for saving our democracy, integrity as a nation. So I'm going to request all of you to please stand up. Put your hands on your right hand on your left side and recite with me the pledge to the Indian Constitution, which is what puts me and you together as a conglomerate to feel Indian and to feel one. And I'll begin. We, the people of India, having solemnly resolved to constitute India into a sovereign, socialist democratic republic, and to secure to all its citizens justice, social, economic, and political, liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith and worship, equality of status and of opportunity, and to promote among them all fraternity, assuring the dignity of the individual and the unity and the integrity of the nation. In our meeting here today, on the 4th of March, 2025. Jai Hind. 3rd of March. What did I say? 4th of March? Pardon me. 3rd of March. Okay. So there begins the age gap. Suddenly, instead of seeing the energetic woman who stands in front of you, you count the number of years I've been on the planet. And that 79 come a few months. So forgive me for misjudging the date. Okay. So today, we are going to say a few things to ourselves about why those of us who have fought to reduce the gap between the privileged and the less privileged, who have struggled for so many things in this country, have done so. I don't think I have sacrificed anything. I've done everything I do for my happiness. If you chat for your happiness, if you talk to each other now rather than listen to me for your happiness, if you would rather go and see a film than listen to me for your happiness, it's your choice. I didn't leave the IAS because I sacrificed anything. I left the IAS for freedom. I left the IAS to get rid of an overhang every evening of not knowing what corrupt practices I had endorsed as an officer on a file. I left the IAS because I felt it was a service. It's only the top 3% of a bureaucracy which is limited in its understanding of the Constitution and of its role in free India. I left because the preoccupation of the system was not to really address poverty or to reduce the vulnerability of our masses, but it was a question of careers. And I felt I did not fit it. So after 7 years of deep trouble, internal troubles and arguments and questions, I left it. The day I left the civil service, I had a sense of freedom. You won't believe it, I'm not telling you lies. It was a sense of freedom, that I didn't have to talk to anyone and call him sir. I didn't have to say to anybody that he was my boss. I was a citizen of India and equal in one sense to the president, the prime minister, the minister, or the poor person amongst whom I lived. We were all equals, which was guaranteed to me by the Indian Constitution. So today, I come to you with the same spirit. I come to you to share with you my ideas and thoughts as equals. I don't think I'm better than you or worse than you. I may have years behind me, but you have a kind of experience that I don't have, which is equally valuable. So are you willing to take me on as an equal? Hands up or down? Yes? So you must treat me as an equal, and that's where I'll begin my discussion with you today. My age is a non-issue. My experience is a non-issue. But today we are standing as equal citizens in a country which is, unfortunately, trying to forego its constitutional values. We are saying to them, look, you and I are equally governed by the Indian Constitution. And that Indian Constitution came to us with great difficulty. I was born a year before independence, and I lived in northern India, in Delhi. And in 1947 came freedom, but what came with freedom was partition. Bloodshed, tears, agony, angst, sadness, and on the heels of it, the death of one of our most eminent Indians ever, one of the most eminent, I'm not saying the, but one of the most eminent Indians ever, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, was assassinated. And the day of his assassination, I still remember as a young person, no one's home, at least in Delhi, had food cooked that day. It's an Indian tradition that when there's a death in the family, we don't light the fire to cook. There was no food. I still remember it as a hungry day, if nothing else, that there was no food cooked. For me, the death of Gandhi was in one sense the death knell of trying to build a non-secular India. People who killed Gandhi didn't want a secular India, and Gandhi wanted a secular India. And for me, therefore, not having Mahatma Gandhi on the horizons of political action meant that we were slipping from our dreams of a secular India. Pakistan opted to be a theocratic state. But if you've all seen Shyam Benegal's 10 episodes on the making of the Constitution, a brilliant set of films, you will know that in India we debated as to whether we should have a theocracy or not. And almost unanimously, we agreed that we did not want a theocracy. We wanted a republic, a secular republic. And today, I have come to you late, but I've come to give the Republic Day address. And for me, it is important to invoke the makers of the Constitution and why they wanted India, a secular India. Why? Radhakrishnan, who spoke about it and wrote about it. Who was Radhakrishnan? Our first vice president and the second president of India, a South Indian who was a philosopher who got his degree from Cambridge. He actually said that if we do not, I'm paraphrasing him, that if we do not look out and we get entrenched in our traditional morality, in our prejudices, India will cease to exist as a nation. I'm Tamil speaking. I've married a Bengali. I live in Rajasthan, and I lived in Delhi, and I don't think of myself as anything but an Indian. But at the same time, I do believe that you can't impose a language on people, that in languages in India are critical political issues. And I absolutely agree with my fellow Tamilian, and fellow Tamilians, if you please, including Perumal Murugan, that Tamil is not a regional language, it is an Indian language. So there's no such thing as a regional language. There are languages in India. You might have one language spoken by a greater majority and the other spoken by lesser majorities. But we are all people with an equality about language and expression. Let me get back to the Constitution very briefly. If you remember Dr. B.R. Ambedkar as one of the most important people in this country, if Gandhi fought for and gave us independence, B.R. Ambedkar has given us the blueprint for a modern India, along with Jawaharlal Nehru, who later looked at development as a part of process. Today, all our educational institutions, our All India Institutes of Medical Sciences, our Indian Institutes of Management, all the Indian institutes of technology, everything which has made you all go in wide, huge shoals to the US, were all dreams of Jawaharlal Nehru. And we opposed it in those days. And we said there should be no specialization of this sort. People will not work in India, they'll leave. And today, those of you who have benefited from his dream of a modern India don't even know that he began it. So all these people contributed to the making of an India. But Dr. Ambedkar, we owe a special thanks for dreaming up the future of this country. So if anyone asks me, what is your dream of India? I say the Indian Constitution is the dream of India. So let me briefly tell you what he said. He said that we can't be content with real only political democracy, which means what? That we have a boundary, that we have elections, that we vote somebody to power. But unless the base of it is social democracy. How many of you have thought about social democracy? Just put up your hands. What is social democracy? It's equality in social relationships. It's fighting discrimination as a woman, as a Dalit, as a person of a different gender, as a person from a different language group, a region. We have to have equality even there. So he talked about social democracy. And he said, what does social democracy mean? He said it means a life which recognizes liberty, equality, and fraternity. Please don't sleep through this lecture. Just listen to it kindly. You know, I am a very astute person. Just 6-7 years ago, I taught in McGill, okay? After that, I taught in the Central European University as well. And I was also a student, so I can make out sleeping members in the group. So just wake up for just a little bit, fight with me, but don't go to sleep. I don't mind your quarreling with me. I'm open to it. But please don't sleep through it. So if you want liberty, inequality, and fraternity, even at your level, what is my package? Everyone gets out of college and says, what's my package? And I asked a person, a young person, what is your package? What are you worth? Tell me. The package defines you. How horrible. How horrible that a package of money should define you. My worth is that money? Am I not worth $1 billion rupees or $1 billion? Is my life not worth $1 trillion? Is it worth just that package that I get? So we mustn't get into that trap. We have to get out of that trap. We have to think every human being is infinitely important and there is no finite end to their worth. If that is so, then we look at how each one's worth can be developed. So therefore, liberty, equality, and fraternity cannot be treated as separate items in a trinity, he said. He said they form a union of trinity in the same sense that to divorce one from the other is to divorce equality, and equality cannot be divorced from liberty. So fraternity, liberty, and equality are both all hung together. He said equality without liberty will kill individual initiative. Do you understand what that means? If I give you equality, but without liberty, like it happened in totalitarian regimes all over the world, it killed individual initiatives. We all know about the Soviet Union, how much it did for the common person, but we also know that Solzhenitsyn and Sukharov had to leave the Soviet Union because they differed from the powers that be. We all know. How many of you know about Solzhenitsyn and Sukharov? Students of literature? How many of you know about Solzhenitsyn? Do you know that there is a Nobel Prize for literature? Yes? Or do you only know what the Film Star Awards are? Huh? I don't even know if it's Film Star. It must be something else now. Huh? So anyway, Solzhenitsyn got the Nobel. So in fact, if you don't combine all these things, and without fraternity and equality, without liberty, would kill individual initiative, and without equality, liberty would produce the supremacy of the few over the many. How do you think these people who earn a lot of money have minds better than us? They only know how to make money, which is a skill. But do you think they have more intelligence than we have? Why? Why should you think that? You must think about these questions. So he said, Ambedkar said, that without fraternity, liberty, and equality, you cannot have a natural course of things. And it would require a constable to enforce them. Because we would fall by the wayside and become a country with inequality, where you will think the IAS officer is so important that you would bow to them and kowtow to them, is after all a servant. It's an Indian administrative service. You're a servant of the people. Why the hell should anyone kowtow to you? I used to feel embarrassed. And when I was a probationer in Tamil Nadu, and going around in 1969, I think much before many of you were born, and I had to go to inspections. Who do you think recognized me? I was 23 years old and looked about 18. And no one recognized me as an IAS officer. They thought it was some woman, some young girl, an alien who had come to Tamil Nadu because I didn't look like a Tamilian. They thought, who was she? If it hadn't been for the revenue board, the revenue peon who went in front of me with a red band on his chest which said Revenue Department, if I didn't follow him, there was no authority. So what is this authority we are speaking about? And why do we speak about this authority as so overwhelming? It's a question I'll leave you with. So what are we who are called activists? What is activism? And why do we all enter into this phase of life where we really look at what's going to be done to us, what's going to be done to others? Why do we go and sit on the streets and fight? Are we doing it for joy, pleasure? Are we doing it for name, fame, money? What is it that makes us do it? And why is it that we do it is what mostly I'm going to talk to you about. The theme of the lecture today is a dialectic of struggle and resistance to achieve constitutional justice. Tomorrow, if you're all chucked out of some place which gives you equal money, you will also go on strike. You'll also go and sit on the street. If individual liberties are denied, you go and sit on the street. If collective liberties are denied, you go and sit on the street. And if you are afraid that by sitting on the street you'll be put in jail, you don't do that. This is all true today of India. I want some participation, otherwise I can't proceed. You can put your hands up, you don't have to talk. How many of you, when you see something terrible happen on the street, somebody being killed unnecessarily, somebody being beaten, some young girl being dragged, or if there's molestation, or if there's a Dalit being beaten because he's drunk from an upper caste well or from an upper caste pot, how many of you feel bad? Honestly, in your hearts. I'm so happy. Almost all of you feel bad. How many of you act? Very few act. So what does an activist do? It's the same emotion that's in you that is in them. But the activist acts. And not only acts individually, but tries to act structurally. Creates organizations that will act on them and therefore get justice. Because it is very difficult for an individual to get justice. So you form collectives. And the act of all this, the activism, is to fight against any violation on human dignity on the basis of inequality, violence, and discrimination. And if you don't do it and I don't do it, who's going to do it for this country? Practically nobody. So you and I have a job. And I remember once, in Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan, MKSS, my parent organization, we get interns. And we had 40 interns one summer, come from IITs, IIMs, National Law School, so many other places. And what we made them do after Narega, that is after 2005, we used to make them go and dig the trenches like the laborers do for half a day. Before that, they had opinions on Narega. They went and dug for half a day and they came back, and in the debriefing session, we always asked them, what did you think? They would come out with extraordinary suggestions, and very good suggestions at that. They said, for one thing, it is not unskilled work, which I had been saying for 40 years now. To wield that pickaxe, that what we call in Hindi gaiti, and that pavda, which is the shovel, requires a great deal of work. When I was working in the 80s, I thought I'm working with workers. How can I work with them if I don't work as one of them? Actually, now I live in Devdungri. I mean, I don't live there now because I'm kind of semi-retired. But till about 10 years ago, 5 years ago, I lived in the Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan's office and home is a village mud hut. So we live in the middle of a village. It lives on crowdfunding. We don't take donations from anybody. And in that life, I found great peace. But I'll come back to it. But when I worked with these villagers, I said, how can I speak for them if I don't know what they feel on their skin, I must know what they feel on their skin and their muscles. It was hilarious. All these women said to me, come on, you're a good for nothing. Please don't take that pickaxe, that Genti. You'll kill yourself and all of us as a consequence. Because it's double-edged. I don't know how many of you have seen it. Sharp on two edges. They said, in Hindi, they said, Bai, which is in Rajasthan, means behen, sister. Tum baith jao. You sit down. We don't want you with us. I said, no, I have to work. So they said, all right, we'll give you the shovel. You'll only hurt yourself, you won't kill us. So come on, use the shovel. I tried to shovel sand. I tried to shovel mud. I tried to shovel stone. I found it impossible. They got fed up with me because when they had done 10 trays of that, transporting it from place A to place B, I was still filling the first one. They said, you're damn useless, you can't do a thing. So what is the definition of skill? Over there, I was unskilled. And so when I wield my pen, they are unskilled. But that's also equality. When you know the skill is not uniformly one thing which I decide because I'm joint secretary sitting in the ministry and saying this is skilled and that's unskilled. Literacy is a skill. Education we all have. The unlettered weaver in Odisha who creates those beautiful Sambalpuri saris is a mathematical expert because he ties the string in such a manner that when he weaves, you get fishes, you get patterns, you get designs. We can't do it. So why do we assume and have the arrogance that we are the only ones who are wrongly call ourselves educated? We are literate. We are super literate. But are we educated? Is a big question mark. So I went and worked with them and they finally said to me, I had to finish my 2 weeks because it was a commitment to myself, but every day I was the laughing stock of that entire group. And they said to me, better go and sit down and forget about us. And I got into a theoretical battle with the government, with the Institute of Development Studies, that you must call them skilled workers. You cannot call them unskilled workers just because supply is more than the demand. The same unskilled worker in England, working on building a house, earns more than a teacher in a school, earns more than probably the assistant professor in a college, because it's a question of demand and supply. But the skilled, it's a skill. It's not unskilled, it's a skill. So it reminded me that what we have to fight against are innumerable. The definitions of poverty, the definitions of skill, the definition. So that is a theoretical debate and a debate which I'm skilled to do because I have the language and I have the tools and I have the process and I know where to go to say what. But when it comes to actually digging the tank bed or making the bund, I'm totally useless. So it's important to understand that activism is not only born out of humanity, but it's born out of an understanding of equality. These are all equal skills. It doesn't make me any less or any more, but I must understand that. So what is a struggle and what is resistance? I had a small discussion with the people who invited me. And I said, oh, I'm sorry. I said there is a difference between struggle and resistance. Do you think there's a difference? Hello? I'm speaking to all of you. How many are you? 250? 300? Come on. Is there or is there not? There is. Okay. In our work, there is. Because a struggle normally is born out of the denial of a promise by the state in the constitution or otherwise. And to protest against the state's denial of these rights in any form or the other, through state action, it is not taken cognizance of. So the protest and the struggle for rights began with, why aren't you paying me the minimum wage? The minimum wage, I don't know what it is in Karnataka, but in Rajasthan it's 256 rupees a day. Do you think a family can survive on that? It's ridiculous. For years we've been demanding that you must raise the minimum wage. And who are our enemies? People who are big farmers, people who run corporations who have so much money. I don't know, billions and billions of rupees. It is not the small farmer. The small farmer has the trade-off. You work on my farm, I work on yours. It's the rich farmer. and you don't raise that minimum wage, I challenge you to live on that wage. Two Kerala scholars, both of them studying abroad, went back to Kerala and lived in a village on Kerala minimum wages, which is the best minimum wage probably in India. Kerala and Delhi probably have a better minimum wage than any other state. They tried to live on those wages and they accepted defeat. They said, we just can't survive. And it's just one person. How do you support a family on that minimum wage? So therefore, all these struggles are based on life situations. And you people, when you look at your packets, you frown at 30,000 rupees a month is considered useless. 50,000 is okay. 1 lakh is all right. Should be more than a lakh. And you have only one soul which lives on that. And here you have a family living on it. And this is India. So that's why they ask. And there's a beautiful song which my friends Vinay and Vinay Mahajan and Charul have sung about freedom. And they've said, we came with dreams when we got free, that we'll have enough to eat, that we'll have jobs to do, that we'll have... And what has happened to us? Where is my freedom? The country is free, but where is my freedom? So these are the questions that activists answer. Where is that freedom? So the first question you ask is to the state. You have a constitution. You've promised me equality. You promised me a share of all the various things that you provided for, a share. And when we asked for 4% of the budget, if every worker, rural worker, and every rural household enrolls in MGNREGA, it won't even be 4%. It will be less than 4% of the GDP. You understand the GDP, of course. You understand what the GDP is? Are yaar, I have a sleepy class. Huh? You understand what the GDP is? What is it? Gross national product, yeah. So it was 4%, less than that. And everyone got upset. The Delhi papers were full of people, economists saying, it will ruin the country if you pay 4% to 60% of India's population. So what is the logic in all this? Yet we won that battle. And that is a story which is quite significant. Probably that's why I'm here with you today, because we won that battle and we got MGNREGA passed by Parliament. So also the right to food, forest, education, etc. So these, for this lecture today, we'll term as struggles. Then we have the protests against the arbitrariness of the state, which we call resistance. And what are these resistance that we have had? I won't go into details because I don't have the time, but the most important recent ones have been the CAA protest, which said that you cannot violate my right to equality in the Constitution and make me a second-class citizen because of religion. Also the farmers' protest, which said you cannot actually pass laws in which we have had no involvement. But all these point towards an extremely important statement by the people of India that you have to have participatory policy making and participatory democracy. Because as you all know, that representative democracy has largely failed us. So you have to bridge the gap between promise and delivery of the state, the governments and the power elite. What is our basic preoccupation with? It's with power. You all thought that if I left the IAS, I left power. How many of you think that I left power when I left the IAS? That I'm powerless now? You think I'm powerless now? Am I more powerful? How? Anyway, we'll come to it when we have the questions and answers. But I certainly do think I'm more powerful. I don't think I'm powerless. There's a famous film, Hindi film, which was called Kissa Kursi Ka. I don't know how many of you saw it. So the kursi, if you sit on the chair, you have power. The moment you get off the chair, then there's no power. Today it's me. I mean, I come here without anything. But it's the power of my understanding or the power of my work or the power of what I did, which is a huge collective of people. And I don't stand alone ever. In the IAS, I stood alone. The moment there was an indictment, I was alone. No fellow officer had the guts to stand with me. But now, in the struggle for minimum wages, in Bhim, in 1992-93, we asked for minimum wages and the government of Rajasthan, then a BJP government, decided it was not going to give us the minimum wage. And there was a program called the Jawahar Rozgar Yojana, which promised that it would pay the minimum wage. So we sat on a hunger strike and we wrote to the government of India saying that if you do not pay this in Rajasthan, you're violating your own promise. Fortunately for us, there was a very, very good civil servant. There are many good civil servants. There were many good civil servants. This man was called S.R. Shankaran, who was very famous in Andhra and in India for his integrity. He was a Secretary Rural Development. When we wrote to him that why you're going back on your promise, he stopped 100 crores to government of Rajasthan as an installment. At the time, before he stopped, the police came and took us all away. They came at midnight and got us all and shepherded. We were about 600 people, shepherded us and put us into vans and took us away. They didn't take me. They were instructed not to touch me. The bureaucrats are very clever. Don't touch that Aruna, but touch anybody else, but not her. So they didn't pick me up. They picked up the others. At that point, women all over the place whom I'd worked with found out that, Arey, Hindi mein bol sakti hu? One line. Ki, Arey, they called me Bai or Behenji at that time. Now they all call me other things. They said, Behenji, Bai ko utha ke le ja rahe, hum sabko jana chahiye. So 600 women turned up from about 300 villages or 30 villages or 40 villages saying we have to protect her. How can we let her go face this alone? Now that kind of support I've never had in the IAS. So activism also generates collectives, communities, support, structures of support, which are extraordinary. Even today, I have a huge structure of support in people. I don't have it with police officers with guns. I don't have it with darbans. I don't have it with officers. But I do have, and some of my comrades are in the audience. They will all support me too, I hope, if something happens. So this actually nature of protest and the nature of resistance and the farmers' protest was extraordinary. Who thought they'd last out for a year and more? What a protest it was, all the world over. They said it was a reinvigoration of democracy. The whole world was, in a sense, in a dump when the farmers' protest took place. I don't know how many of you come from the north, but they sat for 1.5 years. They converted it into a site for libraries, for books, they had every conceivable kind of thing that they did in their daily lives were brought there. Their women came in large numbers, and they finally won the battle. That was an extraordinary protest and a resistance. So I think that the basic engagement is actually, therefore, with the power. Whose power is it that the government has? Is it a power that's generated through money? Certainly not. It's misuse of money later on. But initially, the power comes from where? Where does it come from? From the people. How from the people? With our vote. The Constitution tells me that I'm sovereign. I'm sovereign. We, the people of India, we are the sovereigns of India. And we elect our representatives, who are no more than our representatives. Finally, we surrender to them and give them all the power in the world to torture us, to limit us, to whatever, the millions of things that they do and they or not do or do. What is wrong with the sovereign? You and I are the sovereign of India. What's wrong with us? Friends, have you ever placed a demand on the state? You are the sovereign of India, the ruler of India actually. You just share that vote because you want that man to represent or the woman to represent you in parliament or in the state assembly to do as you want them to do. Do you frame a people's manifesto, which many of us have started doing? Do you frame a student's manifesto? Do you frame a youth manifesto asking for work, for employment, for anything? You are not doing it. So the sovereign is silent. And the public servant is taking over your role, your power, and your life. So people's movements and activism really questions this distortion of the Constitution and of the taking over of that power which is actually mine. And it's that which brings us into the forefront of so many public debates, because the entrenched system is frightened by any articulation or questioning of its negative power, of the way it's looking at distorting human power and democratic power. It's extremely, extremely worried. And of course, there's a question of impunity. Impunity is what? Impunity is the right to do what you want without any accountability. People in power can do anything, but people who are not in power can do nothing. The same crime, a poor person who asks a question in the panchayat about where the sarpanch has spent money and has not given him or her the minimum wage goes to jail. The same person who exploits the system and makes money hand over fist and builds all kinds of things, totally unafraid of the police, totally unafraid of authority, totally unafraid of the laws. So what is wrong with our system that we have failed to make power accountable? So the whole idea of government is a primary concern, and all of you do not take any interest to know how the government is running. It makes policies that will rule your lives. You've all heard of Donald Trump, I'm sure. So Donald Trump has decided that all immigrants shall be sent back. They're sent back. So he does this through what? He does it through a government and government orders. So many Indians have come back with shackles. Did you like it? Did you like your fellow citizens being sent back with shackles? Okay, they needed to be sent back. Did we even protest to say they shouldn't have been shackled? Is this democracy? Is this equality between nations that you send them back in shackles? Send them back, sure. But why send them back in shackles? So governments are under the power of people we elect. And the governments then enact things which go against our own interests. Are we interested in government? We are not, and we keep quiet. And I think the most important thing that our campaigns brought to everybody in India through the right to information is how information is power, and control over information is control over power. And access to all power is through all kinds of information being accessible. And it became a snowball because it began with a protest for minimum wages, became a protest for demanding transparency of all laws at the panchayat level, asking for transparency of governance at all levels. And in 1996, we sat for 40 days in a small town like called Biawar. The whole town joined us. The town joined us. We collected 80,000 rupees in petty cash. Everything opened out to us. The videos were free. Water was free. Food came from the villages. So 400 villagers came to sit with us. They brought food. The whole town of Biawar played, I'm sure you all understand this Hindi word, satta. They played satta on us. One woman came to me, who was a member of the municipality, and said, Arunaji, you have to win. I said, it's not in my hands. Go and speak to the chief minister that he should give us transparency. I said, why are you so interested in it? She said, well, I bet on you, and I want to win on the satta. So if that kind of interest can be generated by a people's campaign, it has just touched the nerve center of democratic demands of the people. So the right to question and the right to transparency is fundamental to our lives. I'm going to skip over many things because I don't have time. So what we are really going to fight against when we want social, economic, and political power is to fight against a totalitarian state. How many of you know what a totalitarian state is? Some of you know. A totalitarian state is that state which curbs all your rights, which gives you on paper all the rights, but gives you none in actual fact. And governance is controlled by a few people. We used to think that, the Eastern Bloc, that is the Soviet Union and its allies, are all totalitarian. But today, it's not associated with communism or socialism. So a totalitarian state can be ideologically capitalist, as in, I don't have to give you examples, or socialist, or it can be on any other political ideology. It's a system of governance. And what breaks the totalitarian system, one of the things that breaks the totalitarian system of the state is information. So if you do not fight for the right to information, you're giving up your citizenship, and you're only going to be a subject. Upendra Bakshi was a very well-known legal mind in this country, and he was also Vice-Chancellor of Delhi University. He used to say, the one thing that independence gave us was that from subjects, we became citizens. Do you want to slip back to being a subject? which means you have no rights, that you will be ruled. You may be called a democracy, but you may as well live in a system of government which gives you no rights. So the right to question has got extremely a great importance in our minds, and it should be at the center of our lives. So when we start through information, asking for information, what we're asking for is a distribution of power, is redistribution of power, decentralization of power. So the 40 lakh people who are asking these questions of a thanedar, a patwari, a policeman, an MLA, a health department, somebody who's to give you anything or the other from the government, or talking about electoral bonds which is passed in parliament and violating all the laws, or any of the other things that they are doing, or questioning the kind of voting that is happening, restriction of people from going to the electoral booth because of religious identity. So many things that they are doing. If they remove the right to question, they become totally totalitarian. They're almost totalitarian. They'll become totally totalitarian if they remove the right to information. So minimal redistribution of power is completely and totally important. So the RTI, what it did was this, and along with the right to information, in the turn of the century, there were too many other rights that were being demanded, all based on the Constitution, to which we took a pledge. The right to work, the right to food, the right to education, the right to health, the right to protest against domestic violence. All these were rights completely within the frame of the Constitution. They were not imagined outside the Constitution. So actually, what we did, in very brief, was speaking truth to power. What does it mean, speaking truth to power? Articulating what is wrong to the powerful. So whether you do it through the written word, or through a protest on the street, or through writing something, you're just saying this is wrong. And that was the first freedom that that is curtailed and we are threatened with. You have the right to freedom of expression? No. You can't express yourself. You can't protest on the streets. The streets are all gone. We used to say the street is our parliament. Without access to the streets, there would have been no RTI. We sat in Dharna everywhere, including Bangalore. So that people came and we discussed, this was our parliament. This was our policy room. This was our discussion room. Because who gives us rooms to discuss all these things with people? So the street became the center of communication, of policy making, and that has now systematically been disbanded all over the country. We can't. Look at our demand from the Ladakh area to get to be a state. What is he asking for, our comrade there? He's not asking for secession from India. He's asking for being recognized as a state. And why should there be laws used against him to restrict him? This is ridiculous. So the civil protests and the welfare of all this is what we have been doing, and that we have evolved structural methods. That's where my skill and your skill comes in. How do you break this impasse with the system? And I'm just not going to go into the history. It's too complicated. There are books outside which you can buy and read. So the struggle is people-based. But when you go into advocacy depends on lawyers, depends on you and me, of how to get the system to respond to our demands. So you meet the elected bodies, you meet the bureaucracy, and you ask them what to do. For instance, in the case of the right to information in the MGNREGA, the rules and laws were drafted by us. I'll give you a small example. We went to the government of Rajasthan and said in 1997, enact a right to information law, at least get freedom of information to the panchayats to give us information. There were 11 members of the IAS and there was no one else. So we protested. We said this cannot be a discussion of a people's law. How can you have no representation? So they included an economist, an agrarian economist, very well known, called Vijay Shankar Vyas, but even then there was no human being who came from our kinds of background. So they had hearings. So in one of the hearings, they said, what do you want? So we were well prepared. We had discussed this law with several people. So we went in with many tomes. And we went there, and when they asked us questions, we not only told them formulations, we told them the source, we told them the legal references. So they went into a huddle in one corner of the room, and they came back and said, you make the first law. You draft the first law. And actually, under Justice Sawant, we had already drafted a law. Justice Sawant is to be chair of the institution in Delhi which looks at ethics in journalism. So we said, we have a law, we'll give it to you. Thereby, we put in a stake that people can formulate laws. It is not necessary that government servants to do it. When I went to meet a colleague of mine in the Prime Minister's office, he said to me, why shouldn't you do it? Because all our laws are framed by section officers. He said the first draft always comes from a section officer. There's no great minds are being applied to formulating any laws. So why not from the people? So these are the battles that bring you into activism and bring into advocacy and engagement. Then the issue is that you have to form campaigns, because how much of it can you do alone? So you form a campaign. They formed a campaign. Some campaign members are here in the audience. It became a huge campaign, so every state had its campaign, every state looked at its laws, every state looked at its particular resistance to sharing information, and finally it becomes a people's movement. So that is the only way the republic will remain a republic for the people who are disenfranchised, people who are unequal. Don't think that because you have access to St. Joseph's College or a good packet at the end of it, you are an equal citizen. You are not. My women friends, you're women. You'll always have the gender differential used against you, no matter where you go. My friends who are Dalits and come from other discriminated groups, you'll always be discriminated against. Religious groups, you'll be discriminated against. You have to have power, access to power which is transparent and accountable for your own good. So the individual benefit and the collective benefit coalesce in the RTI. So it is a very important thing to understand. So the dialectic between struggle and advocacy and campaign makes the government function with ethics, and you and I have to have a better society and a better life. One or two important tools that this whole process has given the world: the role of what is now currently known as social audit. When we went into villages, terrible lies. We were sitting in front of a Patwar Khana, which is the lowest revenue official's office. And we looked at the accounts and it said, building completed. There was no roof, there were no doors, there were no windows. And they said, stone so much. So we have these public meetings without any walls in the village. They were called public hearings. Anyone could come and depose, but they had to speak only on the subject. There could be no political discussion. So they came, and it appeared that there was total fraud, absolute corruption. And there was a huge fire that was lit, political fire that was lit. People went and told the chief minister, don't enter our villages unless you promise to disclose information, because what are you doing with our lives? Even the middle class joined, because they said, you have not denied us a wage, but what you have denied us is the infrastructure. So from that, a huge notion of a social audit emerged. It's become part of governance today. It's used by the Auditor General of India. It's recommended by the Supreme Court. It's part of every institution today that you must have a public audit, not only to see the accounts of where the money has gone, but to actually go and see whether it has been translated into an actual physical being. One last important issue, and that is elections. If you do not take enough interest in the electoral process, you are surrendering the biggest participatory tool democracy has given you and the Constitution has given you. And if the origins of that process begin with corruption and with misuse, how will you hope that in implementation of democracy you will have any kind of justice? So we can't be passive. We have to be actively involved with elections. We have to make sure that the right people go to vote. We must make sure that the electronic voting machines are not playing hooky with us. We have to make sure that my voice is represented. And as I said before, my voice is not one voice. It's the voice of justice. It's the voice of the Constitution. And of course, we have to fight for public space and public protest and how important it is. I think I have come to the end of my hour. I had said I wouldn't speak for an hour, but I seem to have spoken for almost 50 minutes. So I'll come to the end by saying that this dialectical process between people, that is organized groups, which are called protesters, strugglers, people who resist, and the state is doing your work for you. Because it's not benefiting one individual, it's benefiting groups of individuals, it's benefiting the country. Do you think of this 40 lakh people who use the RTI, everyone is from the MKSS? Certainly not. It's a gift you give the nation from the privilege that you and I have got. So it's very important to know about that and to share it. But I want to share with you a feeling of great dismay that I have. And with that, I'll end what I have to say. We are sitting on a time bomb. There is an act called the Digital Personal Data Protection Act. And in this Data Protection Act, you and I will lose all access to information in one blow. Section 44(3) of the Digital Personal Data Protection Act has amended the RTI Act adversely, impacting the ability of people to access information under the RTI law. The rules are being framed, and on the 5th is the last day for protest, that's day after tomorrow. The amendment made to Section 8(1) of the RTI Act seeks to exempt all personal information from disclosure. And what do they say is personal? The exceptions carved out within the RTI, in case, 1 minute. Yeah, the exceptions carved out within the RTI wherein personal information could be denied only if it had no relationship with any public activity. You can't access my health records, for instance. You can't access some things which is my personal data. It's denied on the RTI. You can't take it. Or vital information relating to the state, you cannot access. But in this, it can deny you information which is of public value by using the private clause of privacy. The amendment has done away with an important proviso to Section 8(1) of the RTI Act, which stated that information cannot be denied to the parliament or a state legislature, shall not be denied to any person. Can you believe this? In one stroke, one provision of the RTI Act made you members of parliament and members of the Legislative Assembly. It said what cannot be denied to a member of parliament and a member of the Legislative Assembly cannot be denied to you. That will be removed. The RTI has empowered millions of Indian citizens to seek information and hold the government accountable. It's well established that access to granular information, including personal information, is critical to empower people to undertake collective monitoring. We all work in collectives. Our pensions are not single. It's a bunch of personal information that forms the collective. The amendments made to the RTI Act will place impediments and restrictions on each public disclosure. You have the Kaneja, what is it? What Kaneja is it? Mahiti Kaneja. We have the Jan Suchna portal. The portals will come down. You can't have the portal for information. You will lose it in Karnataka. We lose it in Rajasthan. So the granular information you read to set right corruption will go. The amendments to the Right to Information Act through the DPDP Act will fundamentally weaken the RTI Act. So Section 1(2) of the DPDP Act gives power to the central government to notify the date for the provisions of the DPDP Act. We urge the government to not operationalize Section 44(3) of the DPDP Act, and we have been writing and we will write to you with a format of a letter you will have to write to the ministry concerned so that we register. But look at the cunning of the ministry. They say all our applications will be accepted, but we can't make out how many others have filed against it. So when you file the application, you will send a copy to the campaign so that the campaign knows how many people have actually not wanted the amendment to the RTI Act under the DPDP Act. I don't want to end on a dismal note, but unfortunately it is a dismal scene. But I will say that a dip in public action will bring us more punya than dipping in any river. I promise you. Because when we fought for the Narega, I used to tell people in Hindi, how many people can you feed? We big feeders, no? Anything religious festival we feed. How many will you feed? Just to say 500,000. I used to see you fight for the NREGA and crores of people will eat. What bigger punya is there than working for food for hundreds and thousands of people? So the concept of punya will have to be reworked in our imagination. In all religions, we think we work for the purity of ourselves. And the laws of causality are the basis of definition of all sins in all religions. So we have to reclaim religious morality. We have to reclaim public morality. And we have to reclaim peace. And we have to reclaim the constitution and the vote. So we have to learn how to speak truth to power, make truth powerful and power truthful. And ultimately, it's seeking truth, seeking power. So if there is any international debate which tells you we are the post-truth generation, the post-ideology generation, please don't listen to them. Because post-truth is chaos. Post-truth is not religion. Post-truth is not logic. Post-truth is not science. Post-truth is not genuine democratic politics. I'll end here. Thank you very much.
Please raise your hand to ask question and use the mic which will be passed around.
Here.
Good morning, ma'am.
Just introduce yourself, state your name and your institution, and then you can ask a question.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Yukti, and I'm currently studying in SJCC. My question to you, ma'am, is what do you think true power is? Is it the ability to influence something or the autonomy to define your duties? My question to you is, what do you think true power is? Like, is it the ability to influence something or the autonomy to define your duties?
Why do you think that polarized? They're together. If you don't have the autonomy to voice the opinion that you have, which is based on logic, which is based on justice, it can't be any opinion, then that is the only way you can influence. Otherwise, you can't influence. You and I are not prime ministers and chief justices of India. We don't have kursis. We don't have any of that. We speak from the knowledge of truth and of really wanting benefit to everybody. These two are interconnected, in my opinion.
But don't you think it's skewed? Like, power and the ability to influence and even voice out your opinions is given to only those with authority. And what do you think true authority stems from?
Well, actually, you have to grab your authority. And I think there are so many fake sadhus in this country. How have they got this authority? If a fake sadhu can get an authority, why can't you and I get authority? But we have to work for it. Just by going sitting somewhere and saying something, people are not going to listen to you. You have to provide the body and the substance for what you're saying. But people will listen. Why should they listen to me? They should listen to what's happening. They should have their eyes cleansed so that they can see the truth. So that's for me, the truth is critically important.
Thank you, ma'am.
My name is Anand. So I was a very old RTA activist, inspired by you only from the 2004. So my question is, recently the High Court of Karnataka has penalized the RTA activists for 5 lakhs rupees for making 5,000 and odd RTA applications. So I want your opinion on this.
Thank you, sir. We will take 2-3 questions and ma'am will address together. Students, preferably students to ask questions. The mic can be passed on. There is one at the back there.
Hi, ma'am. I'm Tia from 1BA. My question... is this fine? Is this loud?
Yes, go ahead.
My question is, we all are aware of how corrupt our system is, but none of us really hold the power to do anything or make a change without some sort of harm or risk to our lives and our families' lives. So how would you suggest that us as individuals without a lot of political power go about this or help out with change?
Thank you, Tia. We'll take one more question. There was a student there. Yes, please.
Hi, Aruna ma'am. Firstly, really enjoyed your session. So I have a question about your field that you're in. My name is Siddharth Kothari, 1 BBA, St. Joseph College of Commerce. So being a social activist, there is a risk involved when how media can be posed against you, how a higher authority can frame you or put you in a position where even though you mean the right thing, it can be considered something wrong by the audience because of filtering media. How will you, face that risk? And if that risk is solved, then many of our generations would also be ready to be an activist. But because of the fear of that, we don't take up the role of being an activist. So, answers to that?
Thank you, Siddharth.
I think these battles are collective battles. Even a person like Gandhi, or a person like Ambedkar, or even our contemporary great people have all had collectives. There's no single individual who can fight this, and let's believe that it will be a collective. So half your effort will be to convince and create these collectives and communities of people. If there's a community of people, then yes. I mean, what am I without campaigns for right to information which are fighting in every state, which are looking at the granular details, which are fighting for issues? I may be a token. I am really only a token. Look, how much can I do? So we have to create those communities. And that's the first step in fighting corruption. You must get people together, and it's always our strength lies in numbers. Always in numbers. If we are numbers of people, the opposition by the people who misuse power to silence us will be that much weakened. There are many more things, but we'll talk outside the room. And about this, about media misrepresentation, I think it's the bane of this current generation. In our times, the media did misrepresent us, but there were avenues of getting over it. I think it's a challenge for all of you because of the dependence on the social media that you do. Why are you so dependent on social media? I don't understand. That's because you're not involved enough in public action. If you're involved in public action, it can be a counter to social media. But if you're not involved in public action, social media will wreak havoc with you. So you have to have channels of communication. I don't know whether it will work anymore, but I want to share that our information processes were not dependent on other media that came and reported on us, though it was also that. But we created our own channels. I met somebody this morning who was a street theater activist. Why don't you use street theater? Why don't you use songs? Songs go viral, even in your social media campaigns. Songs go viral. I can't sing very well, but I can tell you 2 lines from one. We had a Dalit, a part of a Dalit member of the MKSS, a lyric writer who was unlettered, but he wrote hundreds of poems, which were converted into songs. That's why I said its literacy is only a skill. And he sang one song. We didn't know how to connect to people to tell them what lay in those records and how important it was to bring them out. And he wanted to tell people. So he sang a song in which he said, in Hindi he said, "Pehle wale chor banduk se marte the, aajkal ke chor to kalam se marte hai raj choron ka." And he said, unless you bring the documents out, we will be thieves forever in our lives. Those documents have to come out. It was a song that went viral, and it went all the way, and including chief ministers heard the song because it had power and strength. I think we need to create these kinds of songs. We have to create an alternative media and not look at what they have control over, but what we have control over. And there have been in the history of India so many strong political movements built on just music. We must look at that music, and your music today is very powerful. Why don't you create songs? Why don't you create, I see them on social media when you create powerful songs or when there are jokes. During the entire farmers' protest, what brilliant songs they created. What wonderful lyrics. So we'll have to look outside the box and we'll have to fight. There is no other way out. We'll have to think creatively and fight. Thanks for asking that question.
Rajaram, sir. Yes.
Thank you very much, ma'am. It was a beautiful talk. I just want some clarity about 2 related things. Why do you think all over the world, oligarchy, totalitarianism, and right-wing politics are coming together across different cultures and political systems. That's one. And the second one is the development of newer technologies and surveillance possibilities that we don't even understand. Do you think that will undermine the traditional agency that people had, conventional resistance strategies? Are they enough now in the face of these disruptive technologies, or do we need to think and rethink our strategies?
You've asked me two very loaded questions on which I could give 2 lectures. So you'll forgive me if I sound superficial. These oligarchies have come to be because now politics doesn't rule us. Money rules us. In my part of the world, recent elections, villagers said to me, why ये नाटक क्यों हो रहा है कि ये बीजेपी को वोट दो या कांग्रेस को वोट दो? अरे वो अडानी और इसको अंबानी को आके खड़ा कर दो ना यहाँ पे, उन्हीं के बीच में उन्हीं को वोट दे देंगे. This is the common perception, not mine. So we are really fighting big money. They have bought up our politicians, they've bought up countries, and they have no accountability, no transparency. Why won't they set up oligarchies? It's easier to control an oligarchy. They are essentially anti-democratic. They're essentially anti-distribution of power. Because you can only get that kind of money together if you do not allow transparency and if you allow amassing of power. That's a very brief answer, but it has many threads which we can talk about. Then you talk to me about technologies. Technology also has the ability to lend itself. It's not neutral. It is neutral in sense of not having an ideology of its own. But it's a tool which can only be used by the powerful. The way it is today, which poor person can use that technology? Many people have fought hard to get technology decentralized. Schumacher, then many other organizations in India, but since I happen to know that Barefoot College Tilonia best, they also argued that technology should be people's technology and you should control the technology. So women should be solar engineers, semi-literate women should be solar engineers. But who cares? Technology is for control. So the essential thing is to control. So you start this politics where you say politics doesn't exist, power exists. Accountability doesn't exist. And you also say that there is no such thing as truth. So you start a truth. 20 years ago, Sunil Khilnani actually told me this in a meeting in Delhi, that this is the post-truth generation. I said, how can you have a post-truth generation? You can't have a post-truth generation. Truth has been the concern for millennia. If you look at the Buddha, Christ, anybody, down the line, everybody has been concerned with truth. Marx was concerned with truth. You talk, political philosophers were concerned with truth. How can you say there's no truth? Post-truth definition, generation, which means that you don't have to rely on truth. It's all convenient. So my truth against your truth, against his truth, it's become individualized perceptions of truth which cannot bind a society together. The second thing they said was post-truth generation, and they also included a post-ideology. Even to say you don't have an ideology is an ideology. Ideology doesn't mean communism. Ideology also means capitalism. Ideology also means this, that, and the other. The market controls us today. And if the market is controlled, it's only interested in profit and loss. We have to make the market accountable. I would quote the Pope on this, because there's a beautiful quotation of the Pope, but I will tell you later how I was so impressed with the quotation of the Pope about how technology and the market cannot control lives of people.
Ma'am,
We have another 5 minutes, so we'll take a couple of questions in one round. Question over from there, from here, and then one from here.
good
Yes.
afternoon, ma'am. And I'm a former student of this college and Aam Aadmi Party member as well. So since you're talking about people movement, there is a saying that don't bite the hand that feeds you. So people have been fed with money and freebies and stuff. so that they don't question the people in power or the people who come to power. So how are you going to, if we have future people movements, how are we going to create such movements like this?
Take another question.
Yeah, one more here. Yeah, go ahead. Frank. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so my name is Sangeeta. Thank you so much for the impactful speech. So my question is, in a people's movement which seeks to protect the interest of the oppressed through structural methods, the same systems that are built on casteism and classism, how can you expect change? Must we view activism through the eyes of Luigi Mangione or Bhagat Singh?
Thank you. The last question, please. Yes.
Hello. Ma'am, I want to ask why being Indian is not enough of an identity for people to unify on the basis of it. Because we have so many divisions among us based on languages, and we all get separated. Na Tamil Karanda, this guy is Hindi, this guy is Rajasthani, and all that. And I also want to draw a parallel line between before the French Revolution and India. It's a very forced parallel. Basically, there were many dialects in the French region, and what they did was to unify. They used the language of French. That's how they were able to come together. So instead of thinking of it in a destructive manner, where Hindi is being enforced on other states and that, why not think of it in a creation manner, where you're not destroying cultures, but assimilating with, using Hindi to assimilate people together?
All right. I'm going to go from the first one, which was about, what was it about? About Aam Aadmi Party. I don't want to go into politics, but I just want to say that every political party must be totally transparent. And I don't think the Aam Aadmi Party is also totally transparent. If the Aam Aadmi Party becomes totally transparent about its money, its expenditure, you have a big plus point, but you haven't done it. And you arose from the RTI campaign. Your leader joined the campaign in 2002. Why doesn't he, and all of them should have had Section 4 implemented everywhere, which is information about the government. So I think unless you do what you want, you won't get it. And I think, though I do think it's a comparatively better party, maybe in terms of its ethics, but it hasn't done what it should have done to claim that, that pure moral ground. Anyway, we'll talk more about it outside, but this is just an immediate response. Then you asked me about, I can't read my old handwriting. What was the second question? Sorry.
What is the class division, caste?
The class, caste. You see, my dear, you asked me that question, lady asked me the question. Yeah, right. It's your and my challenge that as feminists, and that's what I've written in this book extensively because I got the freedom to write, because I chose to write as a woman. We are the future of the world. I think we will talk about personal is political as an important part of it, and we will cross and challenge these divides. No structure should protect you. And I was also chairperson of the National Federation of Indian Women for many years. And in my organization, which is very big organization in India, we didn't allow these divides to come in amongst us. We have to first fight the battle amongst us. We don't let that battle solve the battle amongst us. But we have the possibility of fighting for it, because we look at a world in which equality goes beyond caste, class, religious divides. Because in us, because organically we are made like this, because nature ordains it, or whatever it is, we have a sense of compassion. And that compassion and love should become predominant values. And the fight just to be like the male and to break the male citadel should not be the only agenda. It should be an agenda. But to assert feminist values should become a huge agenda. And I think we will go far ahead of the men in that matter and be able to just draw the outlines of a new world. But we should have the courage to say that we will take up these so-called soft values and put them in the center of our debate. This is something I feel very strongly about in the last so many years of my public action. You may or may not disagree with me, may not agree with me. We can talk about it later outside, but that's a kernel of a thesis that I have in my mind. I don't know how many years I have to develop it and to work for it, but it's something that is developed in my mind recently, and some of it is in my book outside. Then the next one is I am an Indian, but I want to speak Tamil. I want to speak Hindi. I want to speak Bangla. I want to speak Rajasthani, which is not Hindi. Rajasthani is not Hindi. Why do you call Rajasthan a Hindi state? It's not a Hindi speaking state. It's a Rajasthani speaking state. If I speak to you in Rajasthani, you won't understand me, even if you know Hindi. Is some Rajasthani here with you? Yeah, थारे साथ में बात कह रहा तो कौन समझेला काई नहीं समझे समझ गया कि नहीं समझे ना आई बात है so how many of you understand Rajasthani? Don't. So when I go into the villages and I look at the women and I speak to them in Hindi, I'm an alien. When I speak Rajasthani, I immediately go into their hearts. So let's have languages. The more the beautiful. You don't speak English anymore, you speak American. Or you speak Australian, you speak Indish. It's one language only in name. It's used in so many ways. So I won't get into that, but I think there is a very strong part of every human being which wants its culture to be to treasure its culture, to propagate it. We can have an official language, let it be an official language, but that Hindi, have you ever looked at what Hindi they're forcing down our throats? At the time of independence, we spoke Hindustani, which was Hindi, Urdu, mixed with all other languages, even English. They purified it. If I speak that Hindi, neither you nor I nor anyone can ever understand it. The RTI story, the book we wrote in English, was translated into Hindi. Hindi-speaking people have come and told me the English version is easier to understand than the Hindi version. The Hindi is so clished, as they say, clished लिखते हैं. समझ में नहीं आती है हमें ये हिंदी, क्योंकि साधारण भाषा में नहीं है. So what kind of Hindi should be the first debate? Which Hindi? Which is open to Tamil words, Telugu words, Kannada words, Bangla words, and take them all into itself. Even English words. I don't know how many of you are Hindi pundits out here. How do they call a telephone? Telephone का क्या शब्द है हिंदी में? हाँ? क्या है? दूरवाणी. कौन समझे ना? टेलीफोन क्यों नहीं लिख सकते हो हिंदी में? I am a student of English literature. In the time of Shakespeare, it grew to be a huge language because they took words from everywhere. They took French words, Latin words, even Hindi words are in the English language. If you begin with that kind of purist mentality, that language will never be adopted. So the first quarrel was with Hindi, before we talk about it as a uniform language which all of us can speak.
Hello, ma'am. Apologies to interrupt, but here. Hello, ma'am. This is Ritik. I'm from 1BBAD, SJCC. I just have this one question. You were a part of civil service from 68 to 75. What precisely led you to throw off all the comfort and the security and take civil service in 75? What happened?
I think I answered that question. You weren't here. You should ask your colleagues.
All right.
I don't want to bore them to tears. I think I've answered it in what I said and again in a specific question. We'll talk outside.
Sure thing, ma'am. Thank you.
Should we close?
I don't mind. You can ask a question.
Yes. We are pressed for time, so I have a few concluding remarks and probably one last response from ma'am. But before that, I want to acknowledge the presence of a lot of people, a lot of activists. Advocate Professor Ravivarma Kumar sir is here, very well-known name in Karnataka in terms of advocacy for human rights. He was the former Advocate General of Karnataka. Thank you, sir, for being here. And we have Ms. Geeta Menon, we have Ms. Katyayani Chamraj, we have Mr. Viresh, a lot of members of the civil society who have been part of democratic struggles, along with ma'am and so many others. In a way, we have a collective here in this auditorium. One small concluding remark that what I derived from your entire talk is, right now we have a lot of think tanks which do a lot of thinking, provide suggestions to the government. So we have a lot of them. But what really drew my attention when you were speaking is that how the farmers and the workers and the conversation amongst them, right, is the actual think tank that there is, right? And what lesson can educational institutions learn from this movement? I think there is tremendous that educational institutions, especially higher education institutions, can learn from such a dialogue that is happening on the street. When such a dialogue enters such an auditorium, right, what do we lose? What do we gain? Right? Especially from the point of view of education institutions. With that remark, we can close this event. Ma'am, over to you.
I think we have a great superiority complex that thinking only comes with literacy and with staying the way we do with privilege. The first person to bust it for me was Northi. Totally. About whom I write again in this book. But women bust it for me. They told me to go to hell and stay there. Hey, who the hell do you think? You're the only one who think. Don't we think? Who the hell are you? I loved that kind of equality, which really shocked me in the beginning. And I wanted Aristotelian logic. You know, I am a woman, all women are mortal, therefore I am mortal. No, they won't go that way. They'll go their own way to tell you the same thing, but they have their own systems of logic. Why the hell do I think I'm better than they are? They are not. So I think the first thing is to acknowledge not only equality of the right to live, but the right to think, to solve and identify issues. Right to information and right to employment guarantee have come from people. They have not come from us. It's just the recognition of that need that came from us and transformed it. So 2-3 quick tips. One is you must go from the specific to the general. They'll always come with individual issues. I haven't been paid the minimum wage. My child is ill and there's no hospital is admitting it. But it's up to you to link that specific to the general because you're qualified only to do that because you have no specific to talk about. So you qualify by getting that specific to a general. The second thing is what happened with the Narega campaign when they asked for money in the panchayat. Panchayat said no money, go to the state. They went to the state said no money, go to the center. Went to the center and the center did this. So we said, who's to blame? Is it the village council, the panchayat? Is it the state or is it the government of India? Now what battle do you have to fight? You have to fight at all levels. You have to fight at the panchayat level, you have to fight at the state level, and you have to fight with the government of India. And I think that's what strengthens and brings collectives together and what makes movements possible. So in both ways, I think, Vinay, you are right, that these are things which have to be recognized. Like we women, we've fought for recognition. Recognize that I work. I'm a domestic person, I stay at home, I work. Don't tell me that I'm a housewife. I'm not a housewife, I'm a house worker. What are the various things that I do? Why don't you recognize that? So recognition is what we want. If we change our spectacles a bit and cleanse the lens and look at them, we have creativity, we have thinkers, we have communicators, we have musicians, we have the wonder of the world in India. But are you willing to recognize them? That's the issue.
Thank you, ma'am, for this wonderful experience that you gave to all of us. Thank you.